recording. In this next lecture where I talk about Introduction to Motivation for System Science, I'm going to go a little bit lighter than I sometimes do because from the pre-survey responses, a lot of you come with a conviction that you're interested in applying complex systems modeling. But there are some people here as participants who are uncertain about where these techniques fit in, are not certain if it's responsive to their problems, to the challenges that face them, and I'd like to speak to them. But maybe just as importantly, it turns out that there's many different sort of viewpoints or philosophies or emphases that you find from people talking about the types of techniques we're going to be hitting within this boot camp. You'll find very different perspectives out there. And partly to sort of state my preconceptions and that underlie my advice and so on, and partly because I found them useful, I'd like to introduce to you some of the ways I think about these techniques and how they fit in. It might form the types of projects that are pursued for the balance of the work and understanding some of my students' interactions around those projects and the advice that Jeff and I give. I'm not going to have a chance to give all slides here, but I will emphasize a few key points throughout this. So I'm going to try to provide a brief sort of motivation for why we apply these techniques and use that motivation to introduce this kind of notion of system science and complexity science, the science of the whole, as we say. We're dealing with systems where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. They can't be merely reduced to, in a straightforward way, those pieces. Trying to reason about the whole is challenging, and system science has sprung up as a discipline to allow us, provide us tools for reasoning about and indeed helping to better manage complex systems. We're going to talk before the eclipse begins about 3 additional types of system science models that will take us through the boot camp. Now, many of us in this room are from a health science background, and there's many areas of health science where it's long been recognized the complex tangle of issues that shape the concerns when trying to formulate effective policy or trying to understand patterns that we see empirically. Examples would be in the diabetes and obesity area, where we have long recognized certain metabolic components of that are fairly well mapped out for large areas of them. But where those studying obesity have identified a wide set of layered issues that are actually very, very complex, that shape obesity outcomes in the population. These involve complex feedbacks within a given person's body, the fact that our body slows down its expenditure of energy when we try to lose weight. It's easier to regain weight a second time after we've gained it the first time because of the physiology of weight gain. De novo lipogenesis requires more energy than sort of enlarging existing adipose tissue. We recognize that these effects actually end up having a real complex set of challenges they pose at a practical level in weight loss that we see throughout our society. There's diverse actors in this area, spanning from the individuals with weight challenges, but also retailers, agricultural producers, regulators, and agricultural industry lobbyists, et cetera, city planners are even involved in many of these discussions. there's a variety of environments involved, aspects of the food environment, the built environment, the social environment, communicational environment, including marketing, messaging, etc., that are believed to have a pretty important role in shaping some of the factors we see at a broader level. There's a whole layering of issues associated with shifting norms and attitudes and beliefs with respect to weight and weight regulation. And there's complex interactions with other conditions, both in terms of complications and others of very different types, such as infectious disease. And when it comes to something like tobacco, people have similarly articulated these different levels of concern. Oh wow! Thank you very much. Grateful. That's amazing. So with tobacco, we have some very biomedical phenomena at the most basic level. But as Sandra Galea has mapped out, there's this set of contexts that shape the propensity to smoke and that shape the exposure to those biomedical phenomena that are very complex. Factors involving stress regulation and the social context of sharing of cigarettes, the physiological processes involved in addiction, the aspects of the environment and the limitations of that environment and other avenues of relaxation. We have a regulatory environment and sort of a economic context of tobacco use, which also shapes people's purchasing patterns and product switching, etc. And within this context, if we're seeking to, as Jeff says, to put in place fixes that stay fixed in either of these areas, we need to contend not just with the neat biomedical understanding within the body, but with these layering of issues. It extends from economics to physiology to these environments and actors, etc. With many health problems, we have critical periods, diverse actors who play a role, developmental schedules that mean early life insults, for example, cast long lifetime shadows. There's relationships that often mediate an individual's ability to engage in behavior change or openness to that behavior change. There's feedbacks within individuals, between individuals, and for many of us interested in taking a life course approach and sort of look at the broader life course, there's very complex phenomena shaping how early influences translate into lifelong changes. For many areas, we also have very real needs to reason about service interactions and healthcare. When we're dealing with healthcare issues, whether it's related to weight and its implications involving chronic disease, or whether it's aspects of tobacco-related disease and screening for lung cancers and treatments of COPD and other conditions. There's also for many particular questions, there's an interest in understanding the service delivery components, the health care, not merely the health implications of these conditions. There's geographical disparities as well as resources, with traditional measures, we've made great inroads into insights into these conditions, but there are certain aspects of the outcomes and of the current situation that are difficult to measure using traditional instruments. Sandra Galea has kind of mapped out in a very visually impressive way aspects of the food environment that end up shaping individuals' evolution. And Shariki Kumnaika from University of Pennsylvania has also contributed sort of a visual depiction of the layering. And of course, the foresight diagrams from UK have sought to sort of map out systematically different realms of influences involving the obesity crisis in many developed countries, with physical activity, environment, physiology, food consumption, food production, articulated with the feedbacks and interactions between these laid out in a sort of demonstration of tremendous interconnection and complexity. Now, one of the challenges here is, ladies and gentlemen, it's not merely one of detailed complexity. There's lots of little parts. It's system complexity. It's the fact that that interactions of very simple components can often lead to outcomes or behaviors that are very different from what we'd expect from those components in isolation. We could have the best mechanic in the world, but being an expert in drivetrains and axles and engine types and braking mechanisms for different types of vehicles is going to give you very little insights into the dynamics of traffic jams. It's a different level of phenomenon. If we talk about traffic jams, does it have anything to do with engines and cars? Yeah, it has to do with the mechanics. If cars break down a lot, maybe more traffic jams. Cars accelerate and decelerate with certain rates. That's germane. But traffic jams are about a lot more than that. They're a higher level phenomenon. They can't be reduced merely to the axle characteristics of the vehicle. They have to do with visibility. They have to do with the curvature of roads and the size of those roads. They have to do with intersections. They have to do with driver psychology and perception and weather conditions and the network of streets. And so when we're dealing with systems, we need to distinguish between systems that are merely, as Herder put it in the 19th century, heaps. They're simply collections of pieces, and systems that are not merely reducible to the pieces, that exhibit behavior that cannot merely be reduced to and that transcend simply the averages or the sums of the particular pieces. We can get behaviors that are unexpected. We can get behaviors that are surprising about where traffic jams creep up when we're dealing with these, for example, when we're dealing with these higher level phenomena. For example, you may think it's quite obvious. Traffic jams add street capacity, you're going to decrease traffic jams. LA learned a long time ago that isn't actually something that's so obvious. And in fact, there's well-documented circumstances where adding to street capacity to reduce traffic jams actually worsen the traffic jams. Adding in new streets to allow additional choices or routing can actually worsen a traffic jam. There's some non-obvious things when we're dealing with systems which transcend the individual pieces, where we have this sort of emergent behavior. And one of the big challenges when we have a system that's composed of these many moving parts, many interactions of the different pieces, and where we can't simply reduce it to an understanding of the pieces, is that if we try to change the system in some material way, we try to undertake an action in the system, the outcomes are not immediately obvious. So that placement of supermarkets, for example, that we were talking about earlier, the implications of placing a supermarket here or there, it may be in some sense that our model specifies aspects of what is the outcome at a logical level, but we can't take a model that's in our head and reason through consistently what the implications of that change are. There is some logical consistency in terms of our mental model or our model of the world and what the implications are, but it's not often clear what those are without help in adding it up. Here, for example, just to give one more example besides the traffic jams, here in the province we have a large initiative where modeling is one of the central components of it, centered around ED weights. emergency department waits. And one thing that people realized a number of years back is that when we're dealing with emergency department waits, we can't confine our attention just to the emergency department. What's going on in the emergency department is surely important there, but what goes on in the emergency department is a reflection of system-wide issues. It's a reflection of what brings people in unnecessarily to the emergency department. Conditions that could have been treated by a family doctor but fall through the cracks, or could have been caught by home care and don't get caught. But it also has to do with the fact that people are kept in emergency because they can't get to the wards. Why? Because the wards are full. Why are the wards full? Well, the wards are full because individuals are not able to get into community services. Long-term care facilities are full, or there's none available in the particular environment where the person's support network is located. In short, when we talk about the emergency room and solving problems of waits in the emergency room, our sphere of consideration goes well outside the walls of the ER, or the emergency department, and it starts to go to the broader areas of the system, all the way down to how home care is delivered, all the way down to how assisted care and long-term care facilities interact. In order to solve many of these problems, we have to grapple with a complexity of the system in ways that require stretching our understanding. This is a particular challenge for two big issues, and I alluded to them earlier in response to Gabrielle's question. One is we need to explain what's going on. We're often interested in health sciences and understanding, okay, I have some hypothesis about what's going on in the world. Does the evidence that I have recourse to support that hypothesis? Where is it likely to go next? What's driving these patterns that I see, this rapid rate in the number of reported cases of chlamydia? What's driving that? Are we dealing with a sudden change in epidemiology of sexually transmitted infections stirred about by availability of services like Tinder? Why do we see this alarming rise? And sometimes even the question is what I'm seeing good or bad is not obvious. An example is in the chlamydia case, where a rising rate may be a sign of alarm and rising incidence in the underlying population, but it could also be a sign of better reporting over time, that we're simply better at identifying people out there who have risk. Maybe a good thing rather than a bad thing. Trying to understand about why we see certain phenomena, what's going on out there that gives rise to this is often a fairly fundamental need, but it brings to the fore sometimes our limitations about knowing what's happening in the underlying world that's giving rise to this data, the so-called data generating process. People have long noted in health the occurrence of these emergent patterns. Brayley in the 1700s recorded this classic epi curve associated with bubonic plague deaths in London, for example. Till early the last century, there were familiar recurrent patterns associated with childhood infectious disease, a sort of spikes and troughs, these waxing and waning associated with outbreaks associated with pertussis, or with I believe this is measles here. No, excuse me, pertussis in England and Wales. This is for Saskatchewan, closer to home for us, but quite similar patterns. When we're dealing with interpersonal interactions, whether it's vaccine hesitancy and uptake, imitative behavior of cigarettes and e-cigarettes, dynamics of caregiver and child, or caregiver and elderly interactions, we'd like to know sort of what's driving the patterns that we see. Why are individuals coming unnecessarily to the ED, et cetera? We often need to understand these interpersonal issues, which are quite complex and not quite as amenable to traditional methods. We know even with chronic diseases such as obesity, people have documented associations. So this from Christakis and Fowler's work in New England Journal of Medicine a number of years back, showing the fact that that obesity clusters within networks. What's giving rise to that? Is it that people are influenced by those around them and their habits, and therefore acquire similar habits and a similar propensity to obesity? Or is it perhaps people select the people around them as friends who are similar to them? How much of one is playing a role versus the other is a very interesting question. And again, it brings back the need to explaining what's going on. We see spatial patterns of disparity for zoonoses as well as for chlamydia. And so when we're dealing with these situations, often we have some empirical observations, some observed data from the world. And we may have in our head some theory about what might explain that. But trying to go from that theory, as incompletely articulated as it often is in our head, to explain the empirical observations requires us to go through a step here, which is very challenging when we're unassisted. It's trying to elicit what dynamics are implied by our theory. What's the logical implication of our theory for what I should see over time? It may be that in my theory, I presuppose a certain set of relationships. But what does that imply in terms of the higher level patterns that I should see? I need to know that so I can ask, are the empirical observations I observe consistent with those patterns? Is what I'm observing from the world, does it jibe with, does it align with the logical implication of my theory? And when we rely only on informal reasoning here, figuring out what dynamics are implied by theory is hard. As Gabrielle said, we might anticipate there's an upwards relationship based on what we posit in our model between weight and people's preference for food. But just what the shape of that is, just how it is reflected in light of the differential availability of food in different neighborhoods and so on, might not be entirely clear based on the relative distance to a grocery store or a convenience store. It may not be obvious. So, when we have these systems, particularly we get unexpected behavior from them that challenge our ability to reason intuitively. So we'll have, for example, phase changes, a situation where a system may change dramatically in a short period of time, from a situation where herd immunity has been achieved, a tipping point has been reached, and if someone arrives in the airport with a certain infectious disease that's not going to spread beyond one or two people, to a situation where we may see waning immunity proceeding to enough of a level that outbreaks start to happen again. We're seeing that with some childhood infectious diseases here in Canada. We have systems level phenomena in the form of spread over social networks, trying to understand how obesity spreads in a network, or how memes about vaccination hesitancy spread within a network. We have issues where we have what are called lock-in. A system gets caught up in a certain state, and it's much harder to shift that after the fact than it is to prevent it in the first place. And addictions is an issue like this. Once people get caught up in a vicious cycle of addiction, it's much harder to get them out of it than it might have been to prevent them from getting into it in the first place. Systems level phenomena of familiarity, and there's an important component of non-linearity here. If we have two policies, for example, we combine them together, we may get results very different than the sum of the benefits of each. So one big need with complex systems approaches that's challenging when we're unassisted is the need to explain. Another big thing that's challenging is the need to intervene. When we're facing health problems, often there's a set of questions that come to the foreground if we're thinking about new policies or interventions. One is, where do we best intervene? At what stage of the process? Should we engage in primary prevention? secondary prevention, screening for individuals who may have early signs of a condition like lung cancer. Should we engage in prophylaxis and protecting people who may be at risk or focus on treatment? Regardless of which stage of the person is, which target groups should we focus on? How soon will I see effects? There's some tragedies in the health space where a very solid policy may be put into place, but it's declared dead and buried before it can really have a chance at changing things. Where we cut it off before its full effects or its significant effects can be felt, because we don't know how soon they should occur, and we're not sure, and we prejudge it as having failed or having minimal effect. But it's simply we don't know how long we have to wait. When it comes to implementation science, we have another set of issues. How do we scale it up? How do we make it financially sustainable, for example? How do we translate it from one environment to another environment? When we need to intervene, our challenges are particularly keen because we have these set of issues that are causally tangled together, and we need to reason about how a given change is going to ripple through the system. How is it going to affect things? Who do we intervene on? How soon, etc. And the challenge here is that we're interested in having a theory of how things are in the world, but we're thinking about some alternative policies. And we're interested in getting some desired outcome. And we'd like to reason about what sort of intervention, what sort of change do we need to achieve this desired outcome. And the problem is, if we're relying on informal reasoning alone, it's going to be hard to put together a theory of the world and these changes to understand the implied dynamics. What is going to come about because of this change is not entirely obvious. There's a bunch of complex things that mediate these dynamics, a bunch of complex interactions between these tangled factors. So we put in place a new convenience store, but there's a set of factors involving the pre-existing dispositions or preferences of people in that area, their access to convenience stores in the area, the parks nearby. There's a set of factors which are governing what comes out of the dynamics beyond just the intervention. And we have to combine it with some theory about what's going on in the world. The issue here is particularly challenging in the health space because typically we don't have recourse to having observed this intervention in our jurisdiction previously. Sometimes it's not been observed in any jurisdiction or any jurisdiction plausibly similar to our own. And therefore, we don't have data to observe directly about its outcome. We can't simply look at the associations that have been achieved by it in the past because we don't have the data. We are going off-road. We have been driving on a standard road. Now we're talking about going off-road, and our needs are quite different. We're talking about going to a situation that's counter-factual, where we don't have evidence. So we want to reason reliably about what the desired outcomes are and how they compare between different interventions so we can choose the best intervention for our circumstance. But because we don't have statistical data about the outcomes of those interventions, we need different tools to ask these what-if questions. Now, reductionist approaches, taking pieces apart, studying them in isolation, has offered profound insight and will continue to offer profound insight. This bootcamp is not about a way of moving to replace that. It's about complementing those techniques so that we can arrive at fixes that stay fixed, in Jeff's immortal words. Reductionist approaches have offered great insights, but they have certain limitations to how they can help us in this domain of larger systems. They focus on the pieces rather than about how all those pieces come together to yield the observed outcomes. And they have challenges looking at counterfactual regimes where we are we are looking at novel policy impacts, for example. And look at multi-scale impacts between what's going on the micro level and the macro and meso levels. And making decisions without an understanding of how they're going to affect the whole can be very challenging. I'm skipping forward here, but when we're dealing with these complex systems, they raise real challenges in several areas. They exhibit often counterintuitive behavior that's not obvious. We may anticipate a relationship of some sort, but sometimes we're surprised. It's not infrequent that in working with these tools that we will sometimes get surprises. There can be misperceptions. We say this growing rate of reported cases is a crisis, and it turns out to be a success in reporting. There's cases of policy resistance, cases where we undertake an action to stem off a problem, and it ends up diluting or defeating, and in some cases reversing the gains we hope to achieve because the system responds. We're pushing against the tide. We may end up, by contrast, be able to take advantage if we're sharp enough in recognizing there are tipping points. If we can just invest enough, a little bit more at a certain point, we may make a qualitative difference and things change totally. That's a very favorable aspect of complex systems, but we can end up facing the opposite direction where things change for the worse very, very rapidly unless we're savvy about this. Now, these phenomena and the general complexities of these systems, the fact that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, poses real problems for several things. One is to learn from experience. It's painful and slow. It's unclear what generalizes without tools to help us. Coordinating within these systems is difficult. Often people working in different areas of the system, prevention on the one hand versus service delivery and treatment, they may be at loggerheads. They may see themselves as in competition or one as shortchanging the efforts of another. They may have little understanding how their interactions interact, and they may work at cross purposes. It raises challenges for planning and deciding because there's unclear trade-offs between choices and for how to design a system most effectively. So we get circumstances where we end up solving one problem and we end up being bounced into another, for example. Or where we put in place a set of actions which ripple around to cause us grief afterwards. Not infrequent within the space of health, and I've listed a bunch here that are indicative of that. So without understanding the underlying system in a more rigorous way, we risk serving as the advisors to King Canute, urging him to extend his lordship over the incoming tide, and railing against the nature of things. If we're not savvy about the nature of things, we're bound to run afoul of it and to work at cross purposes of it. So to address issues like this, to address this need to explain and to intervene, we turn increasingly within health to system science, this sort of science of the whole. And the fundamental reflection is all those patterns that we saw, all those patterns of change over time, change over space, and in networks, etc. It's reflecting on the fact that those come not out of thin air, but they're created by some data-generated process. There's an underlying process that gives rise to them, an underlying set of governing factors. And many of the health problems that we deal with have these tightly tangled processes that underlie them, entangling of personal circumstance and preferences with aspects of environment and policy regimes, etc. And to really understand why patterns persist and why they resist efforts to correct them and how we can most effectively lessen them, we need to reason consistently about the processes giving rise to them, just as we need to reason about the timing of the tides to sort of not work at cross purposes for this. So system science is a collection of methods that is designed to help us visualize, understand, reason about the implications of understanding regarding the underlying processes of the system. System science models are different than traditional statistical models in a number of ways, but perhaps the most fundamental is they posit a certain causal structure of an underlying system, most typically in the form of dynamic models. They posit this is the connections which obtain causally between these factors. And as such, they capture in an operational form sort of our hypotheses concerning what's going on out there in the world, how diverse factors are interacting in the world. They're depicting how things might work out there in many cases to serve as thinking tools for refining our thinking and to share our assumptions with others and to ask about counterfactuals. I provided this to you in a separate slide, this science advising a complex systems approach or system science approach, because we'll be referring back to it in exercises this afternoon. But these are some features that are hallmarks of complex systems or systems that where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And when we're dealing with those systems, what we often turn to is dynamic models. Simulation models or dynamic models, I use the terms almost interchangeably here, but reflect on the fact that simulation models are actually somewhat of a subset of dynamic models. There's some dynamic models that don't happen to be captured in simulation. They're more mathematical in character, and we're reasoning about it analytically. But simulation models are a key part of dynamic models, and the one in which we concentrate in this boot camp. They represent these hypothesized causal relationship between how factors in the world interact over time. And they provide a way to examine diverse consequences across an entire system of changes in certain areas of a system. And they help us and other system actors to understand vulnerabilities of the system, leverage points, areas where data can be particularly helpful in sharpening our expectations of what will be going on in the future, ways of fruitfully changing the system structure, improve ways of working together. So one of the things that contributes to confusion in this area is that these dynamic models or simulation models go by many different names. And even the term simulation model is overloaded. We build statistical simulation models. I do quite a bit of MCMC and particle MCMC, and there we're doing simulation in a statistical sense that's quite different. I'm talking about here models that are dynamic. They simulate change over time. We call them often mathematical models, although it's again a poor description. Causal models, although that term is also overloaded in the statistics area. We'll talk about causal statistical modeling. The defining goal here is to examine the dynamic behavior over time, hence dynamic over time, resulting from some hypothesized causal structure. If we posit this causal structure, what's the logical implication of it over time? But these models are distinguished by the fact they're, as we say, mechanistic or generative. They're models of the plumbing of the system or the physics of the system. They articulate a theory about how things fit together in the system. And at any given time, we hypothesize the system is in a certain state, some of which we might not observe, much of which we not yet observe. And they let us simulate the step-by-step evolution of the state of the system over time, the status of the system over time. And because we're capturing positive causal relations, we can anticipate outcomes for counterfactual situations. We can ask questions about situations we haven't directly observed. Now, these sorts of models and simulations are very familiar throughout many areas of our society. I would never want to fly in a plane without a pilot who had gone through flight simulators for thousands and thousands of hours under all sorts of hypothetical conditions. Going through this so that they know how to fly through the outskirts of a thunderstorm. They're familiar with how the plane behaves in all sorts of precipitation or under high winds. You want someone who's developed that skill because they've examined counterfactual situations as a pilot that lets them make more savvy decisions about how to pilot your plane under the vagaries of weather they encounter. And so it is with many areas of work, particularly in the engineering sciences, where these sort of models are familiar. But I want to emphasize a certain perspective here. And my perspective here has been really enriched by, I've been doing agent-based modeling now, for about 27 years. Probably more years than some of my students are alive. And agent-based modeling was my first tool of choice in this area. But for about 20, 24 years now, I've been also doing system dynamics modeling as a key part of my repertoire. And there's some perspectives that come out of, particularly out of system dynamics as emphasized, that I'd like to share with you, because I think they're very valuable for me. There's a meme out there, often tacit, that models are like crystal balls. They're these tools, hopefully very, very accurate, that allow us to evaluate future outcomes. And where we're going in terms of anticipation, and how that might be different in the event of an intervention. We often think of models societally as sort of this crystal ball. And if that crystal ball is flawed, the model might as well be shattered. It offers no predictive value. It's not accurate. It's a failed model. That's sort of the meme that's out there. And I argue that that's a very dangerous meme. It's a meme that's unrealistic. It's a meme which, more importantly, shortchanges the profound ability for models to help us in much more important ways than telling us what will happen. Models are best viewed, again in Jeff's immortal words, as thinking prostheses. I think of them as thinking tools, but he sharpened that. He said thinking prostheses. No, you may wonder what canes and crutches and other types of prostheses have to do with simulation. Well, the fact is, ladies and gentlemen, prostheses, whether computational or physical in nature, are designed to complement our limitations. They help us take our limitations. Maybe it's a foot that I've injured. So a few years back, I injured my foot and I had crutches. I had broken it, and those crutches allowed me to get around despite my disability. Simulation models allow us to accomplish our goals and pursue in an appropriate level of function despite our limitations. But the limitations are not musculoskeletal in nature. They are about our reasoning. They're about our ability in our head to reason through the implications of our assumptions. We have limitations about taking a fully articulated theory of the world, even one that's as precisely mapped out as that first one we were playing with earlier, and understand what's the logical implication of that at the individual level, at the higher levels of interaction. We have great powers to which we can apply our minds, our brains, but there's limitations of them. And one thing people are just not very good at is quantitatively understanding the implication of a certain set of assumptions that are quite complex and tangled. At MIT, John Sturman and other colleagues in the system dynamics literature have done really interesting experiments about people's reasoning about complex systems. And what they found, and it's well documented in the literature through experimental psychology type studies, is that even the most highly trained people from STEM backgrounds, science, technology, engineering, and math, posed quite simple problems analytically, make gross mistakes in their judgments involving complex systems. We're just not wired up in our biological complement to deal well with these challenges. We need assistance. Just as with my twice broken foot, I needed assistance. I took it in the form of crutches. Here, ladies and gentlemen, we take it in the form of simulation models to help us total up, to help us tell us what our logical implications are of our assumptions. To go, in short, from this to implied dynamics. We're not very good about adding that up in our heads. We're poor, and a simulation model can help us. Computers, ladies and gentlemen, are really good at doing dumb things fast, undertaking certain rote actions in a very rapid way. And that's what we need. We need something that totals up the implications of these assumptions over time. In a way, each step of it is very straightforward. It's just we're not very good at doing it in our head. So simulation models here are these sort of learning tools. And in addition to helping us simulate the model, they help us understand to what degree is this model reflective of evidence in the world. So we may describe our assumptions in this model. We're not positing that the model is a crystal ball that's going to guide us. We do so in many ways to ask, is the logical consequence of these assumptions consistent with the empirical evidence we see? Is it consistent with what we see from the world? Does it jibe with our observations? Does it jibe with expert knowledge? Does it jibe with the understanding of the qualitative observations of those who have worked in the system for a long time, the phenomenology of it, as we'd say in physics? Models help us more quickly spot if there's an inconsistency there. If there's an inconsistency between what we think might be going on in the world and what it actually implies as simulated through fully consistently, we've learned something. We've learned that, oh, okay, I need to debug my thinking. Because we carry around these mental models of the world, and if they sit purely in our head, we can't see the logical implications of them well enough to spot if they're consistent with the empirical evidence or not. But if we can spell out their implications over time through use of a simulation, we could say, okay, that is consistent or that's not consistent. These models help us learn more quickly if there is an inconsistency, and they can help more quickly learn from us the logical implications of our assumptions if there's not an inconsistency. If what we're saying is pretty consistent with the evidence, they can help us understand, okay, well, what would the implications be for interventions, for changes to the system? What would the implications be for explaining patterns that we see, where those are coming from? So they can help us learn more quickly, inconsistent, thoroughly, quickly, consistently, reliably, rigorously. They can help us think more deeply through what's going on in the system. Why do we see these patterns? How would those patterns be different if we put into place an intervention? And by such, they can inform our choices. And they can advance our understanding by refining, over time, our thinking about the world and refining the models to reflect that thinking. So, ladies and gentlemen, when a model that we build does not jibe with the evidence, this is not a broken crystal ball which merits smashing. It has spotted for us a hidden bug in our thinking, a hidden inconsistency in our thinking, and it's a success of modeling. It's not a failed model, it's a success of modeling if we can learn from our mistake and translate that to better thinking and better modeling. If we can translate it into experimenting with the model and ask, okay, if that didn't jibe with the evidence, what would better jibe with it? We can use the model, in short, as a thinking prosthesis, one that complements our limitations and helps us think through more consistently. So the dynamic model helps us more quickly iterate with this and ask, okay, is this consistent, thereby refining our thinking back here. So it's this kind of co-evolution of our mental model with experimenting, observing, observation, saying, are those consistent? And hopefully having some chance to collect different data about the world, shape what data is collected or shape what actions we undertake in our model. So simulation models, when when used, they serve different purposes. At the most basic level, they help us make explicit our model of causality. What's going on out there in the world? This hypothesis about what's going on in the world for discussion and collective refinement. They take it out of our heads and they put it in the clear light of day where others can critique it. That's an important step just by itself. Even if we didn't have simulation, if we put down the model for critique, it's precise enough that someone could take issue with it. And there lies the possibility of advancement of the science. But models also can help us learn more quickly from the evidence, and when things don't jive with our theory. They can assist, however, more deeply in the management, or additionally, in a very important way, in the management of complex systems. They serve as these what-if tools to identify policies that are desirable, as defined in terms of take your pick, cost-effective, high leverage, robust, etc. They can help us evaluate the benefits of restructuring a system, help us understand trends and explain those trends, help us prioritize research and data collection, understand classes of context between which we can adapt strategies, and they can help us communicate with others. So there are some big limitations associated with simulation models. A given simulation model is typically focused around one or just a few defined purposes. This is not a model of the system that is going to serve as the one model to rule them all. They are typically specific to purpose. And models as such, which are for different purposes, look quite different. And sometimes we're constrained by external factors of what purposes is realistic for a given model. I mean, I flashed these up here. My colleagues Don Burke at Pitt, Dean of School of Public Health at Pitt, or Josh Epstein until recently at Hopkins and now at maybe NYU, they've enumerated dozens of uses of models. But that's not to say that a given model can choose between those at will. A given model may be constrained in its area by certain factors. For example, is there theory available? We use models sometimes for theory building and other times for theory explication. If there's pretty good theory or a set of competing theories about an area that are pretty well established, we might use models for theory explication. We want to elucidate what's the consequence of assuming this theory versus this one. Is it consistent with the evidence? Ask what would the implications be for an intervention, a change to an anticipated program. If there's very little theory, we might engage a model for theory building because we don't have the option of specifying things with the level of specificity to recognize the underlying cost effectiveness of some change. There's just too many big uncertainties, so we engage in modeling for theory building. And similarly, if evidence is really shortchanged, looking for quantitative outcomes might be, in terms of policy trade-offs, might be counterindicated. Characteristics of dynamic models. All such models, regardless of tradition, we'll be looking at, depict the behavior of a system over time. There's some evolving state of the system. The current situation changes over time as time progresses, so we're going to represent some state. In that first model we created, there were states associated with a person's weight, another state associated with what state were they in. Were they at home or were they engaged in shopping behavior? There was a state associated with how many convenience store meals they had in their larder, or how many supermarket meals. Those are aspects of their current state. And at a given time, if we had frozen time, we could have seen, okay, this person's in this location, that person's in that location, etc. When we have dynamic models, that changes over time, that underlying state. We're simulating the system over time. The models specify incremental changes. Given what the current situation is, what changes, what might we expect? The likelihood of going shopping, for example, or the level of the quickness with which energy is being expended or being taken in, given that current state. Model behavior for these dynamic models, these nonlinear models, generally cannot be pre-specified in closed form. We can't write out a neat formula that tells us over time this model implies, an exponential increase in weight based on, some formula for how it depends on preferences for convenience store food. With nonlinear situations, we typically cannot derive such closed form characterization. We don't, it just mathematically, we have no means of deriving that. And so the way in which we figure out the behavior over time is simple step-by-step simulation of the evolving state. Each of the state, figure out what change will take place in the next little bit, and simulate it accordingly. Now, the underlying systems here are generally nonlinear, and the models are as well. This means a variety of things. One of the most important in the health area is that response to multiple interventions often lead outcomes very different than the sum of responses to each in isolation. We may have two different interventions, one focused on prevention, one focused on treatment. And if we sum up their gains, it may be profoundly different than if we considered each in isolation and added together the gains of each. After all, the prevention one might relegate the fact that we actually don't need to treat as much, right? Or maybe sometimes we have interventions that even work at cross purposes. In other cases, they may be synergistic. They may, screening and prophylaxis might work together in a synergistic way. So with nonlinearity, one of the consequences is if we want to simulate a portfolio of interventions, we can do so. And we have to recognize that we often do want to do so because each one in isolation, examining each in isolation is not going to give us all the insights we want. We also have a situation where there's particular subgroups or sub-areas of the model where the tail wags the dog. Certain subgroups may have a disproportionate impact. It's all about, that particular subgroup. I want to introduce this notion of models as maps because it's another powerful analogy, ladies and gentlemen. And I think it's one that has its limitations but is pretty effective. If we wanted to travel through our fair city, many of us would turn to a map. Which map we would turn to would be different given our needs. If we wanted to, like Mike, bike through our city, we might use a map of bike paths through the city. If we wanted to drive through it, a street map that shows the streets. If we wanted to figure out why brownouts were occurring in certain areas of the city, we'd use a different map, or why flooding is occurring across the river on White Swan Drive, we'd use a different map showing the topography. Maps, like models, are abstractions of the world. They hide a lot of detail. And they're useful precisely because they do hide detail. I never want to drive with a map in my car that had every blade of grass on it in the city of Saskatoon. Not only would it have to be updated very frequently, but it would be so voluminous as to be burdensome. With maps, we view the abstraction from detail, hiding of detail, as an asset. In models, it's like that as well. We're not seeking here the perfect map. The only perfect map of the world is the world itself. The only perfect model of the world is the model itself, is the world itself. And neither of those is very useful. So maps are specific to purpose, models are specific to purpose. Which details we omit depends how we wish to use them. What things we include, what things we don't. All models, like maps, are, in the words of statistician George Fox, wrong. But some are very useful. And their incompleteness is what allows them to confer value. The fact that we can reason about it in a tractable way, the fact that we can build it in a defined time and use it to ask questions comes about because it hides details. It is a necessity to hide details. It's a learning tool to help us ask, if we imagine these set of factors as governing things, what are the logical implications? And often that they are good enough to account for the phenomena of the world. But with models, we're always learning what needs to go into the model. The viewpoint here is one articulated first, and again, I'm grateful to Jeff for having highlighted this, by Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon, long before there were computers in which to run models, I don't have the quote here. He said, "One sooner evolves truth from error than from confusion." And that sounds paradoxical. It sounds downright heretical, perhaps. How can you get truth out of error rather than out of confusion? Isn't it better to be skeptical and confused than to commit yourself to error? Well, it was the 16th century version of fail early, fail often. The idea is take a stance, try something, observe if it's consistent, and learn from it. Don't be afraid of trying something defined. Have a working hypothesis, see if it works. If it doesn't, refine that hypothesis. Fail early, fail often. Fail forward. Fail in a way that helps us learn. With a model, we have this systematic way of replacing confusion by learning, and by allowing us to reason about what's going on out there in a consistent way, they aid in theory building, testing, and refinement. And they help us learn more quickly. And by putting forward a poor model advances knowledge by helping us spot these inconsistencies between our assumptions and evidence, by helping us more quickly know vastly more quickly than if it just stayed in our head, this doesn't add up. You have to rethink this part of it. The other thing you need to ask is, what's the alternative here to using models? All of us, to some degree, use models. We use what are called mental models. They're characterizations in the world about what's going on in the world that are hidden, that are reasoned through informally, that are incompletely formulated, that are sometimes even incoherent, or exhibit cognitive dissonance, where part of us thinks one thing, part thinks another thing. They're difficult to share. They're difficult for someone else to critique. They're hard for understanding the logical implications of our choices. And they're often way off from a very grounded description of the world. They're often too inchoate, often to fully understand their implications. And it's risky to rely on such mental models with profound questions. Better, in my mind, to learn and have this iteration going with an explicit model rather than to depend on a mental model which is partly shrouded. Okay. Common concern for all the modeling techniques we'll be dealing with is what quantities are generated by the model. We divide up quantities into three parts. And this afternoon I'll be asking you to undertake an exercise which does this for your problems. We divide up quantities in a model into three parts. One part is endogenous. These are quantities that are generated by the model. The model tells us over time what happens with these quantities. It generates, it produces them. We're often interested in how those change in response to, say, policy change or questions about context. If we were to change this assumption, how would it affect the model behavior? We saw that earlier, right? Having to do with a person's weight or the amount of food in their larder, or those graphs we saw associationally. We saw that if we put in a changed assumption, say about whether physical activity was undertaken and considered effects of nearby parks, how would that affect things? These are things the model is producing to us. We learn them from the model. We observe them from the model. There's a second set of things that are represented in the model, but the model doesn't tell us about them. We tell it about them. These are what are called exogenous things. We impose assumptions on the model. Sometimes they're constants. They are at the least pre-specified. We say this changes over time in this pre-specified way. These are exogenous quantities. Model tells us endogenous quantities, it's generated by the model. Exogenous quantities, we tell to the model, assume this. And then there's the third set of quantities, which are of nature involved, which are ignored. We are consciously omitting, hopefully consciously, sometimes it's unconscious, ignoring them from the model. We're ruling them out. The model has to start simple and only grow incrementally. And so we may have these on the side, parked for now, for later consideration as we learn from the modeling process. And capturing additional features endogenously adds some additional power to the model, but it requires more time and resources on our part, and it's more challenging to reason about. So, a couple key take-home messages from this. Addressing many practical challenges is especially hard in health because they exhibit features of complex systems. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. We have trouble reasoning about how even change to the system will ripple through to changes to the system as a whole consistently, unless we describe it operationally in a precise way using the tools of system science, namely dynamic modeling. System science provides us with these tools to represent and reason about the behavior of complex systems. We saw that representation of person and name earlier. And system science provides us with the tools to then reason about its behavior over time by running that model. And models express these operationalized dynamic hypotheses, operationalized because we can run them, dynamic hypotheses about changes over time, about the processes that underlie the observed behavior. To put it in the words that statisticians would be familiar with, to represent the data generating process that underlie our observations of the world. Models help us understand what's going on and how interventions might affect things. They're specific to purpose, and multiple and hybrid modeling techniques are complementary for describing complex decision-making challenges. Now, in the course of this boot camp, we will be focusing on three major types of models, three major traditions of modeling, as it were. And I'm quickly going to comment on those three major types here. Okay, and I'm looking for the appropriate lecture here. It's called Dynamic Modeling Types, I believe. Okay, so I'm actually I'm not sure why I'm not seeing it here, but maybe I didn't. Here it is. Dynamic modeling types. Okay, if you don't see it in your folders, I'll put it there over lunch. Okay, so I'm just going to load this up. There's three major types, and I'm just going to do give some Whirlwind comments on each type and get us out for the eclipse here. Okay. The three major types are system dynamics on the one hand, agent-based modeling on the other, and discrete event modeling. All three of those types are supported by the software platform that we're going to be using, AnyLogic, and all three types will be discussed and featured within this bootcamp, although the focus is predominantly on ones as they hybridize with agent-based modeling. So system dynamics is a feedback-centric process that focuses on feedbacks and accumulations. Feedbacks and accumulations. And it's notable for offering a methodology that characterizes feedback-based systems using both qualitative and quantitative means. So it has a rich set of ways of depicting these diagrams using what are called causal diagrams that we'll be seeing this afternoon, as well as using quantitative tools in the form of stock and flow diagrams that can be simulated. And it traditionally does have a very rich mathematical foundation based on what are called ordinary differential equations. But at the same time, it has a strong emphasis on stakeholder involvement in collaboration. And it's out of system dynamics that you really see emphasis on what are called group model building, participatory modeling coming to the fore. which we'll be talking about in this boot camp. It's notable in that the software that we use with System Dynamics permits a focus on what's being characterized and less so on how it's being simulated, the details of it's simulated. And typically System Dynamics focuses on changing how people think about the situation, the mental models involved. And as such, much of it is pursued in a participatory fashion. And we'll see some examples of these causal loop diagrams. These are examples of the semi-qualitative models that are used within System Dynamics to illustrate complex systems. System Dynamics quantitative models are characterized using stocks, which are accumulation, and flows into those stocks, where the stocks capture the current state of the system, the current situation, and flows capture the changes to that situation. So the things that build stress might be a stock. There's a current situation with respect to stress, and things, on the other hand, build up stress or reduce stress. Those would be flows associated with it. So weight was the stock we had in that first model, and then there was energy expenditure, and through physical activity, energy expenditure, through basal metabolic processes, and energy intake. Those were flows into it. So here, stocks, the current state of the system determines the value of flows over time, and then flows dictate the value of the change in the stocks over time. And you can have rich nonlinear models represented with this, and to a degree they can be subject to formal analysis. We use them a lot with machine learning techniques to combine in latest observation of data, and you'll be seeing some elements of that, including from the extraordinary work that Anahita has performed over there. System Dynamics has notable strengths. It can be an exquisite tool for characterizing feedbacks involving continuous variables. Everything from person's weight to aspects of their level of viremia that they have and the response of the immune system, to issues having to do with addiction dynamics, to factors having to do with level of contamination and reservoirs for cholera that carry cholera, Vibrio cholerae. System Dynamics models can be very rapidly prototyped very quickly. And they have rich support that's been built up for participatory modeling. There's really not programming in the most classic, in the sort of traditional sense of it involved. And there is recourse to formal analysis and really strong support for intuition building among stakeholders. Agent-based modeling, by contrast, is defined with one or more populations composed of individual agents. Those individual agents are associated with parameters that specify assumptions about them, either continuous or discrete, a certain state, the current situation of that agent. They have certain actions that they can undertake that change that state, and rules under which those actions are undertaken, and they have some means of interacting with other agents or the environment. So they can pollute the environment with prions, or they can communicate a norm to a neighboring agent, for example, or engage in needle-sharing behavior that transmits hep C to a neighboring agent. The model is further defined by a time horizon, and whether it's continuous or discrete, and some initial state to the model. So there's one or more populations of these agents, and these populations evolve over time. So we might have a theory of personhood and then many particular people, and each of these people has a characteristic, and then each person in the population, so the theory of personhood in fact includes the fact people have an ethnicity, a sex, and an income, and then each person in the population would have a specific ethnicity, a specific sex, and a different income, and it would differ from person to person, okay? Agent-based models will typically have state associated with the agent, and state might be this individual is pregnant or non-pregnant or susceptible, exposed, infected, or recovered as far as their state. And a given person will be in one of these states at a given time with respect to a given state chart, which represents a certain concern. But a person may have several different concerns, and so with respect to one state chart, I'm in an exposed state. and I'm not open to seeking care due to past adverse trust issues with seeking care. And over time, I might evolve in my openness to seeking care, perhaps as my symptoms rise, and I might evolve in terms of my, my disease characteristics. These individuals further can interact with others, say through networks. So, for example, we can add contact networks in to connect individuals up. And just as with system dynamics, there's emergent behavior that results. But with agent-based modeling, we often get dynamics not only over time with respect to, say, stocks and system dynamics, a person's weight changing over time, but we also get dynamics with respect to states and topology, networks. So we'll have something like this. The model of chronic wasting disease, a disease in which Maria is one of the foremost experts worldwide. And you notice the buildup of prions on certain lakeshore margins from these deer that are circulating. That's an emergent pattern. And I didn't know to anticipate it. You could have said, well, it's logically implied by my model. Yeah, I would agree what it was, but I didn't realize it was logically implied until the simulation totaled up the assumptions, and I realized, oh my God, that's what's happening. I never realized it. There's spatial dynamics which can occur, in terms of regularities, and there's dynamics over networks. In contrast to system dynamics, ABMs are typically stochastic. You can have stochastic system dynamics models. You can have deterministic agent-based models. But most typically, system dynamics models are deterministic. You run it with the same set of assumptions, you get the exact same results. Agent-based models, you run with the exact same assumptions. One run, you get some results, others a little bit different results, and we'll be seeing how we manage that in the course of the bootcamp. To ensure model results are not merely flukes, we run the model many times. We run what's called a Monte Carlo ensemble. And run many realizations of it. And stochastics are an asset. They require us to run the model many times, but they can help us make sense of variability we see in the world. Discrete event modeling is a process that maps out workflow that's often defined, and particularly for service delivery, this is an exquisite, extremely powerful, extremely concise language for characterizing the dynamics associated with service processes. So we have workflows that we map out in a very transparent fashion, good for stakeholder engagement. And an individual is posited to flow through these. Think patients within a hospital or within an animal hospital. Think individuals presenting in a social services workflow, applying for Veterans Administration benefits or what have you. They proceed, those so-called entities, proceed down particular lines of workflow, and their progress is typically mediated by resource availability. So they have to wait for the CAT scan, or they have to wait for the x-ray machine because it's currently occupied. Individuals interact with each other through resource limitations. So I keep you waiting or you keep me waiting. But those are typically the types of interactions, in contrast to an agent-based model where I may give you a disease or I may share my norm with you. Notable features of this are capacity to reason about queues, the fact that people are kept waiting in longer queues, that we could ask how long those queues are, how many people are in them, or how long it takes how long people are in there on average. We have processes that kind of operate on the agency. Agents here, the entities are more passive. They kind of flow through the system. In contrast to agent-based modeling, where kind of the entities are the center of action. And the entities interact with resources of various sorts, which can be quite well articulated. There's flowcharts characterizing this, and the resource pools are capacitated and can actually be quite rich in terms of their scheduling, etc. Discrete event modeling is without peer in its ability to crisply represent processing of defined workflows in the context of limited resources. We can use it to identify impacts in health service delivery in the health context throughput or waiting times, how many people we could treat per day, and the waiting times associated with them, the backups, how many people were losing due to balking, to leaving without being seen. And we can look at how that varies with level of resourcing, coordination of those resources, placement of those resources physically within a facility, and how facility layout affects things. It has also less reliance, compared to agent-based modeling, on computational skills of particular individuals. Ladies and gentlemen, nature waits for no person. The eclipse, I believe, is upon us. I would like to suggest that rather than impairing yourself with my commentary, we go out and examine the eclipse. I believe Kurt is in the area with his viewer. If not, we'll quickly fetch him. So thank you very much. We will repair to the faculty club. There is an outside patio if any of you want to make use of it. And we'll make sure that we distribute some devices for eclipse viewing. Rest assured, we've not tried to force upon you any glasses, so you don't have to worry about impaired quality. We're making use of pinhole camera type events. And I'll turn to Kurt for leadership in that area while I rest.
Can we leave stuff in the
Yes, we will lock the door, and we'll lock it, and during times it's not locked, someone will be here at all times. Okay, and that will continue through the boot camp.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.